yet another star-studded cast of cross-partisan participants. Good to have you guys this evening. Good to have so many special guests. I'm going to briefly go around the horn to introduce each of them. Cal Davenport, of course, is no stranger to either Saving Elephants, and this is the second time, I believe, appearing on the panel. He and I were brothers in arms in the tragically defunct Are We Right podcast, and always good to have you with us, Cal.
Glad to be here.
Elizabeth Dahl was also a guest quite a while back on the Saving Elephants podcast, but she comes with us. She is with Braver Angels. Pardon me, I almost said Blazing Angels. Braver Angels. You might consider a name change. I think that might be an improvement.
That could be something else entirely too.
Yeah, maybe it wouldn't evoke what you
has a very different meaning here.
It has a different connotation. And since your build is like the largest grassroots organization trying to depolarize the United States, maybe blazing is not the phrase you want to go for. You, of course, are the director of Braver Politics, and you have the distinction of being the first person on this panel. I've done many of these panels, but the very first one who has no facial hair. So the very first woman to join us, not the last, because I am very excited to announce it, and no discredit to you being on here, Elizabeth, because I'm happy to have you, but I'm very excited to announce joining us later this evening is going to be Beyonce. So I'm thrilled to have her with us. I'm going to add to the call now Mike Taylor. Mike, good to see you.
I'm not Beyonce, but I'm glad to be Beyonce.
You're not Beyonce, yeah, but she'll be here soon. We got in touch with her people, and she's supposed to make a surprise appearance, so we've been assured. So look forward to that. Mike, good to have you back. You are the host of The Political Mike, the aptly named The Political Mike. I've had the pleasure of being on your show a time or two. Occasionally as the lone Republican, and you are tonight the lone Democrat, though I think you will find we are the other four of us Republicans dwell within a spectrum of Trump skepticism, so there's not just uniform thinking among us. And then last but certainly not least is John, and I do apologize, I should have asked ahead of time. I'm not even going to try to butcher your last name.
That's all right. Gio Karas.
Gio Karas. Okay. I thought that might be it, but I didn't want to mess it up there. John Gio Karas, thank you so much for joining us. John and I have met briefly prior to this, but he comes highly recommended by another Saving Elephants, a friend of Saving Elephants, Eric Cohn, who assured me, and I can attest, having talked to you, that you are a reasonable and a reasonable Republican who is less Trump skeptical than Eric or I. So very good to have you on the podcast or on the show tonight.
You know, some might say I'm more reasonable than most, but I'll try my best.
Oh, dear. Well, I have a number of questions I might ask, but as I often say, I know our panelists are more than capable of giving us their 2 cents without me having to prompt. So I'm just going to make this very open-ended. We can go around the horn in whatever order you guys would prefer. We just watched the debate. Maybe for some of our audience, we watched it so that they didn't have to. What did you think?
Well, I can start. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Before I give my thoughts about the debate, I just want to disclose that I personally believe there was no political benefit to debating Donald Trump, period. And I thought that, you know, as the summer continued to progress, I think that the Biden team might feel the same way today. The truth of the matter is, after nearly 10 years of watching the same Trump show, I don't know who, unless they've been living under a rock, is undecided about Donald Trump at this point. And while the argument could be made that this was an opportunity for Harris to be distinguished with Trump, the truth of the matter is the choices between a pro-democracy candidate versus someone who tonight quoted a dictator in Viktor Orban as reason for the American people to support him. That's the bottom line. I thought that the first question which was posed to Vice President Harris, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, was an opportunity for the vice president to say 4 years ago, the American people were locked in their houses because there was no federal coordinated effort to combat COVID. There was mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I thought she was effective in making and laying out her vision for building upon the economic success that we've seen. The World Bank has acknowledged last month that the U.S. economy is stabilizing the world economy. The United States inflation rate has fallen below 3% for the first time since 2021. Wall Street is doing well. Crime is at a 50-year low. These are things that I was expecting to hear more, but Harris, I thought, was very focused. I thought she was poised. I thought that she was sharp and on point. And the truth of the matter is, it's incredibly difficult to go up against someone like a Donald Trump who's going to sell 60 lies a minute. And I thought that because there was this kind of building up towards the debate that this was a prosecutor versus the convicted felon, that it could possibly have resulted in a disappointing showing, being that the expectations were so high for Harris to perform that people were not expecting to get what they want. That is not the case after tonight. I think Harris directly looked at Trump in the eye, and you can tell Trump was pissed off with her. He didn't even want to look in her direction. This is someone, according to the folks in his inner circle, he does not deem her to be an equitable rival to him. He respected Hillary Clinton. He does not respect Kamala Harris. And tonight, she proved why he ought to respect her, because she pulled out the receipts. And I'm looking forward to getting into it later in detail tonight, but that's my take.
Wow, that was a pretty combative hot take off the top. Something a little bit more, I think, pro-Harris than I expected. I did think that she won the debate. I'm going to back up a little bit and start from the top and give my overall notes, which is that I thought the moderators were better than in a lot of past presidential debates than that I have seen. The moderation style seemed to work really well. I thought that obviously the moderators were biased, but since I lived through the debate where Candy Crowley gave the questions in advance to one of the candidates in the debate, it really is hard to get any worse than that. And this was significantly better. I thought it was interesting that it ended up not being Harris who was able to use the "I'm speaking, don't interrupt me" line. Instead, it was Trump who pulled it off a couple of times toward Harris. I don't think she was expecting that. She looked a little bit peeved that had turned the tables on her. On the flip side, anytime Trump started to answer things well, and I think he did actually have a few answers that were good, like legitimately surprised me, and left me like, oh, he has actually learned something over the course of several years. I wasn't sure that he would actually improve in debate. He has improved substantially. I did not think expectations were very high at all for Kamala Harris. I thought, in fact, her team was significantly lowering expectations ahead of debate, complaining about not getting their way in changing the debate rules that were agreed to when Biden was still the nominee, setting the expectation that Trump is going to be interrupting her, setting the expectation right up front that there will be a lot of lies from Trump. And of course, he handed her all that she needed. He is his own worst enemy. Nothing has changed about that. I don't think you can say that Trump dislikes Kamala Harris any more than he disliked Hillary Clinton. If anything, I think he was much more abrasive to Hillary Clinton. You had the whole physically wandering behind her on stage during that debate, and lock her up. That is not something that he is using against Kamala Harris. So I would not agree with very much of anything really that Mike had to say about the debate.
I didn't say like, I said respect. And I think there's a huge difference. And I think
either one.
He saw Hillary Clinton as someone who could defeat him. He cannot fathom Kamala Harris defeating him. And I think Kamala Harris, one of the things that this debate, and I do agree with your point that David Muir and Lindsey Davis did a much better job than Dana Bash in moderating this debate. For one, in the era of Trump, the role of the moderator has become so confused. And the fact that so many times, whether it's Trump on a debate stage or Trump in a town hall meeting, the notion is just pose a question and whatever comes out of his mouth, we'll just move on to the next segment because we've got a certain amount of topics to cover within a specific period of time. But what's more important is making sure that both candidates are operating on Earth One in the realm of fact. And many times David Muir had to say, Mr. Trump, that's not true.
But
that's not
frankly, I think that's completely wrong. As a conservative, debates prior to Trump, you ended up with Trump because the debate with Mitt Romney went so poorly, because the moderators were so horrifically biased against him. Republicans have refused to participate in debates despite actually really enjoying debate and the idea of debate, because the moderators are so terrifically biased. And this is true here. And what you're just saying right now is that what is most important is that the moderators apply their set of facts to Donald Trump. Never mind applying fact checks to Kamala Harris, who they didn't push on abortion, who they didn't push back harshly on, well, what would you have done different about immigration? How would you fix immigration? Who they didn't push back on a number of issues where they could have. Every aspect that Trump brought up of, well, you know, you're saying that you changed your policies, but your values haven't changed. But why have you changed your policies? And she didn't answer any of that. All she said is, oh, well, this is my value on this, and this is where it comes from. But her policies have changed. She didn't explain why they didn't push back. And so this was still, and then there was the whole layup question where they asked Trump about why did he bring up her race? And then essentially asked her to comment on why he'd mentioned her race. Like, and she was able to just say, oh, well, I don't believe in separating people by race. The entire Democratic Party's progressive philosophy has been dividing people by race, particularly since 2020. And she was dead center of it in 2020. Donald Trump was right to push back on her. Something I think he said really well in the debate was saying, you know, she went to Minnesota. She supported Jacob Blake, who tried to stab a police officer in the midst of his arrest as he was being chased down while kidnapping his kids. She went to visit him in the hospital and supported him. And I'm supposed to believe that, oh, she's not divisive on race at all. Look, I don't think Trump should be commenting on her race. I think it's very obvious. She is biracial, and people are politicians. They code switch. They talk about different aspects of their background to different audiences. All of that is normal political stuff. There's no reason that Trump needed to highlight it or discuss it. I think that was all bad. At the same time, that was a layup question from the moderators that should have never been a question in the debate. The American people don't care what stupid thing Trump said yesterday at a specific press event. It wasn't an important item, and it was a softball question for Kamala of the kind that Trump didn't receive any.
I couldn't disagree more with the premise. I just want to say briefly, 2012, sure. In 2012, you know, shortly after what happened in Benghazi, what happened between Obama and Mitt Romney was an exchange about how long it took for President Obama to go out to the Rose Garden and issue a statement about what just took place in Benghazi. Mitt Romney misquoted the amount of days that took place. Candy Crowley, as the moderator, made sure that we were operating on Earth 1 to make sure that
Candy Crowley gave the questions in advance to Barack Obama
to make sure that the debate can continue, so that we're both operating in the realm of facts. And so when we're talking about the role of the moderator and we're talking about Kamala Harris switching issues, I mean, I find it laughable. I mean, you have Trump, who sat with Chris Matthews. I've had him on my show 2 weeks ago. Chris Matthews saw it. I saw it. Chris Matthews said, I gave him the opportunity to clarify what he meant on abortion. He said women should be punished. Women should be punished. Go back to that Wisconsin exchange between Donald Trump and Chris Matthews, and that's what he said. But today he's talking about how he's the biggest leader on IVF. That's flip-flopping.
I feel like you and I are now arguing about Donald Trump rather than arguing about the debate. And I don't actually want to get into a debate with you about Donald Trump. I would like to actually talk about the debate that we just watched.
Let's talk about the debate as it pertains to Kamala Harris and whether or not she has changed her position on immigration. She made it clear, look, the Republicans twice had a bill written by James Lankford. Are you going to argue that James Lankford is a liberal? Donald Trump tanked that bill for political purposes, and he could not deny that. So Kamala Harris said, I will sign that bill if given the opportunity. We had bipartisan support to address many of the issues that conservatives are complaining about at the southern border. So it shows that country did not come first as it pertains to that issue. As it pertains to abortion, Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party has never advocated for anything unreasonable other than allowing people to allow them to have autonomy over their own bodies.
That is completely false.
This argument,
it is not your body at 9 months of pregnancy. It is not your body.
Well, let me, okay, guys, I'm going to hop in here for just a little bit. Speaking of the role of moderator, I'm going to be a moderator here for just a moment. And I do appreciate the enthusiasm with which you both are bringing, but I think we could all admit we may have strayed from the original question. Probably my fault for making the mistake of giving such a darn open-ended question to the four of you who obviously have opinions. But let me try to recenter there the debate overall. And I'm not saying we can't return to some of these issues, but I want to give John and Cal an opportunity to weigh in. You're more than welcome to comment on what Elizabeth and Mike had just said, but I would encourage you to go back maybe to the debate itself, and let's build up from there.
I felt like we were about to have a debate about the debate. We're having a debate within the debate. That's all right. That's all right. I love it. As far as the debate itself goes, I mean, I personally, it makes me want to either slip my wrists or just move to Switzerland or something. I'm not a big fan of either candidate personally. I will say this: going into the debate, I was very curious to see. I do think Kamala Harris had a low bar to clear, and she did clear it for the most part. I was kind of taken aback at how easy it was to get Trump off his game, and bait him with personal jabs about the size of his rallies or people leaving early or his personal fortune. And next thing I knew, I thought he was getting pretty defensive and loud and focusing on that rather than focusing on her and her record. He did stress. Frankly, I thought his closing statement made all the points he should have been making throughout the debate. If anyone was still watching at that point, I know I was, pretty much falling asleep by then. But I do think Harris is going to come out of this debate a little better than what I was expecting. I do think she cleared her bar. I do think Trump was a little defensive and off his game. So, is it going to make a big difference in the election? Probably not. I'm still of the opinion that, debates for the most part, with one big exception last June, usually don't do a lot to affect the outcome of elections. And I'll be very curious to see if there is a second debate in October, because at this point, the Harris campaign is probably going to conclude that they don't need to do another one. So while they've agreed in principle, and there is a vice presidential debate set up between Walz and Vance on October 1st, while they've agreed in principle about potentially doing a second debate in October, I'll be really curious to see if that comes to fruition, because if anything, I'm betting that the Harris campaign is probably thinking, that's it, they're good. They did the one debate and they don't need to do another one.
Cal, what are your thoughts?
Well, I sat down probably for 30 minutes of this debate thinking it was looking like Donald Trump was about to wipe the floor with that debate, because I thought that VP Harris looked nervous anytime that she would kind of make a misstatement or just stumble over her words. She would start to kind of lose her composure there a little bit. But to her credit, I think that she was well prepared to just stick with it and keep hitting those points, because Trump started off looking pretty disciplined by his very low standards, which is about all that he needs to do. And about a third of the way in, he really lost that. Harris did a good job of just continually bringing up those things that he couldn't help but respond to. I think that John brought up the best example of that, the size of the rallies. There was a clear opportunity for him to even just say something real quick and move on to what the meat of the question really was. And he didn't do it. He spent the entire time talking about the size of his rallies. And
Well, he eventually talked
that's
about
what we-
eating pets, I think, at one point.
That
Yeah.
was the point where he started to really lose it. But that's the thing with
He
it.
talked about that in his opening statement.
It's insane because he has the capacity. I mean, this is one of the reasons why moderating a debate with Trump is so difficult, because on the one hand he's going to just run roughshod over his time limit, but on the other hand he's just such entertaining television. He had the craziest line in the debate about somebody eating dog. I didn't even follow what he was saying, who was eating dogs at this point. And then his whole line about the platform, basically the Democratic platform basically being some sentences like run, spot, run, which was hilarious. You know, they had like the best line and the worst line in the debate. And he's just all over the place. He's a loose cannon. What do you do with that as moderators? I think that is actually a really unique challenge that I'm not sure that I fully agree with either Mike or Elizabeth on, because on the one hand, you do want to keep things in the realm of reality, and Trump has an unprecedented ability to leave reality behind as he's talking and rambling. But on the other hand, you also have to not make it look like you're taking sides in a debate of that magnitude. So I don't envy the moderators. I think they did an okay job. I don't know that I was super impressed with that, but again, I don't envy that tightrope walk they have to do. The last point I'll say is that I agree with Mike as well, that there's not a lot politically to be gained out of this. I didn't hear a lot from either candidate that really reached out outside of their existing voting bloc, the people who are already going to be voting for them. Trump is in the position of not being president and of prices all over the US rising. He's in a perfect spot to criticize the existing administration, to make populist talking points, and yet all he does is he goes off on these tangents and rambles. When he sticks to that message, he probably appeals better to maybe somebody who's less politically engaged, but he can't be disciplined enough to do that. Harris had no ability to get in touch with anybody from a populist angle, which is kind of the moment that we're in and what she needed to do. And so I don't think anybody really persuaded anybody who hasn't decided already who they're going to vote for. And so what did they gain? I don't know.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, let me jump in here right quick to ask, because I want to return to something you and Mike were talking about. Maybe that's a mistake. Maybe opening a can of worms there. But, and Cal, you kind of brought this up too. You said, I think Calvin Moore is right. You say what I think sometimes, maybe it's because we're both Burkeans. This whole issue of when a moderator is supposed to jump into a debate is something that I personally don't have a very clear line in my mind. I think sometimes I think you can, at least for me, make a case pretty strongly either way, as to occasionally it's appropriate, sometimes it's totally inappropriate. And I say that in the sense that from a partisan lens, I think almost anybody could say, well, in that instance, candidate X said something that ought to have been fact-checked in real time. I mean, how many Republicans, when Obama was president, this statement about if you like your insurance, you can keep it, was considered to be the greatest lie ever told. But I don't know that most Democrats would have said that's something that should have been fact-checked, say, like in a debate. On the other hand, I think part of the problem here is Donald Trump stands so far outside of the way our politics was designed to work that it's hard to know how to apply these rules to him. And I don't necessarily mean this as a deep criticism of him. I am critical of Donald Trump. But it's the person who tells the lie that is so insanely unbelievable. It would almost be bizarre not to bring up, wait a minute, what did you just say? And so I think there is some responsibility on the part of the moderators. That being said, there's a very careful line to cross there, right? Because, I mean, on the one hand, let's just assume if the moderator themselves were biased, and we're hoping one of the candidates would win over the other, trying to prosecute the person they don't like is not going to help their cause, right? And so I think they have both a moral obligation and even I'll say a political and a personal obligation to try to literally be a moderator, not weigh in, not look like they're biased, not look like they're trying to push it one way or another. But that can be difficult when both candidates, let's be frank, Donald Trump lies. So does Hillary Clinton. So does Joe Biden. So do all of those other opponents. They just do it in a normal way that's harder to sort of fact check in real time.
So I have some thoughts about this because I've actually run some candidate debates and moderated. And so the thing that I've come to realize is that writing rules for debates is easy, and enforcing those rules well is really, really hard. And I have come to be something of a speech purist about debate. I think that when moderators, particularly with someone like Donald Trump, step in to try to fact check, you cannot fact check everything. It's happening way too quickly. So then you're in the business very quickly of picking and choosing which items are we fact checking and why. And if you're creating a framework for that, now it's going to apply more heavily sometimes to one candidate than another. And now you are unfair. And also now the moderator, every time they step in to correct something or to fact check something or to push back, the moderator becomes the focus of the discussion rather than the debate itself and the candidates on the stage. And so I have come to think that it is best for debate rules to be simple and easy to enforce for the moderators, and fact checking to be extremely rare, but rather to allow ample rebuttals, as was done in this debate, something that I really, really appreciate about this particular debate setup. To allow the candidates themselves to prosecute their case against their opponent and to do their own fact checking in real time and pushing back on the opponent's claims. Let the adversarial nature of debate take care of the fact checking as much as you can during the debate. And then afterwards, the people who are interested will research deeper. I think that generally audiences understand that you cannot take at face value really anything that is said in the context of a political debate, because even the things that are true are spun with a partisan bias. And so I don't necessarily think that fact checkers pushing back in the moment or moderators pushing back in the moment with fact checking does anybody any favors. I think on the net, it ends up interrupting the debate, changing the focus of the debate, and derailing potential critiques and interactions between the candidates, which is not necessarily the way that I thought about it before I started actually running candidate debates myself.
I'm sorry.
Also, I just wanted to completely disagree with Cal and say that I don't think that Kamala Harris needed, or was it John that said Kamala Harris needed the populace? That's not her lane. I don't think that she needed to appeal to the populace. She did she made many overt appeals to Republicans, kind of your traditional high propensity swing voters, and soft Republicans to come join her. It was very clear that she had been trained for debate by former Republican officials on former policy and Republican wonks. The way that she talks about Israel, for example, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has dramatically changed from the way that she talked about that conflict just last year. So I think that you see a lot of shift in that, and I don't think she needed to attract populists. I think she's trying to attract the high propensity voters, which are the ones who will actually win the election, not the low propensity voters who may or may not turn out.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I do want to respond to that a little bit, just because I agree with you actually on a lot of that, and I wanted to emphasize that my point was a little bit different from that. I think that what we have right now in terms of the issues that are popular, that are on the minds of voters, tend to be very populist oriented ones. And I think that yeah, it's not her lane. That's a little bit of a weakness that she has at this moment with the issues that are at play in this campaign, and also being a part of the outgoing Biden administration as well. I think all of those things kind of come together to say, to kind of put her a little bit behind where she probably like to be. That said, I think that her appeals to her overtures, I guess, to Republicans probably demonstrate about as much understanding of conservative viewpoints as Donald Trump does when he talks about his ideas, which is not very much. It's sort of a caricature. So I'm not sure how effective that's going to be, except for the former Republicans who will say that they're still conservative, but will vote for Democrats as long as Donald Trump is alive. That sort of bulwarky type of Republican probably likes that talking point, but they're already voting for her anyway. So again, I don't know what she gains exactly there.
I do want to just look at a historical context in terms of the role of the moderator, since we've been talking about it for some time now. And I'm thinking about 1976. The incumbent president, Gerald Ford, of course, this was during the Watergate era, was going up against Jimmy Carter, the governor of Georgia, who was little known in the primary, but he was, one of the first few candidates to break out after the Iowa caucuses. And they're talking about foreign policy, and Gerald Ford makes the statement, under a Ford administration, there will be no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be. And the journalist who was helping moderate the debate at the time, Max Frankel, actually had to say, he had to cut in and after that remark of the president to ask, for clarification, because that was just completely inadequate. When we go throughout history, we see that there are moments where the role of moderator is not just to pose questions, but I think that it's actually integral to democracy to ensure, as Cal was pointing out earlier, that we're both operating in a realm of fact. And I think that, going back to, other countries, you could see how misinformation fuels the deterioration of democracy. You look at Russia. Vladimir Putin's Russia is a state-controlled media that disseminates false or misleading narratives. Conspiracy theories are rampant in Brazil, where Bolsonaro rose to power in 2018. We don't want that in the United States, because that would equal the exact same outcome that those two countries resulted in. I do believe that there is a time to fact check, those kinds of policies. But you mentioned, Josh, the Obama healthcare policy, that was inaccurate. Let's talk about that. But when we're starting to get into the realm of conspiracy theories, when we're starting to get into these dark these areas, we're going down a dangerous path. And I thought that was evident in the way in which Trump kept repeating, no president has won more votes than I did. That's going back to the lie that he won the last election. If we don't have faith in our democracy, if we don't have faith in our system, then that's just going to fuel the deterioration of how this thing moves forward. And I think that I was actually hoping that Kamala Harris would say, no, Mr. President, that former President Trump, that's not true. Biden won more votes than you in 2020. And, that was just one example. He said that only folks on his side died on January the 6th. That was, of course, not true. And Kamala Harris brought that out. As it pertains to just the body language, because a lot goes into these performative debates, and a lot of it deals with body language. You go back to 2000 and the famous moment where George W. Bush looks up and down at Al Gore. That was a plus for the Bush campaign. It made him look relatable. It made him look like I'm not going to be intimidated by this guy, Al Gore. The moment in 1992 when George H.W. Bush looks at his watch, that was a negative moment for that Bush campaign. When Clinton sprung off of this stool to go and embrace the voter in the town hall style debate and said, can you repeat the question? How has the economy affected me personally? Those are moments that go down in history as, this really changed the tide in terms of how people thought about these candidates. I think tonight I had to disagree with my friend Kyle a little bit. I think Harris looked very well disciplined. And there was moments where she looked at Trump who looked tired. He was hung over the podium. He was not coherent. He was not disciplined at all. He started off talking about one thing, and by the time he was done talking, you ended up in 5 different directions. Kamala Harris looked at him like she was very concerned, that she was peering into him to see what did it, trying to figure out what he's trying to say. And a lot of Republicans got a lot of gratification from the way Trump looked at Biden that way on the June 27th debate. Tonight, I think the script has been flipped. I think Harris looked like the one that was really concerned about Trump's well-being as he continued to, go off the cuff and not even in his closing remarks. There was no cohesive narrative. Kamala Harris kept bringing it back to you, the people. She kept looking at the camera and she said, "This is not affecting you, the American people. Let's stop talking about silly stuff and talk about the things that you're worried about, whether it was on the issue of immigration. Are you concerned about safety? Well, he put your safety in jeopardy. He tanked that border bill that would have done something effective on the southern border. Are you concerned about bodily autonomy? Well, he is not. I believe that folks who should have that opportunity to make a decision with their families and their doctors. You go down the list, climate change. She said young people appreciate this issue a lot. She talked about the investments the Biden-Harris administration made as it pertains to climate change investments. And so I think time and time again, she looked at the camera and she made, there was a lot of body language moments that were a plus for the Harris campaign, while Trump looked like you could just take him and pluck him in a Trump rally and it was the exact same Trump you were going to get that you got tonight.
Honestly, I hate analysis of body language. I think that most of the time it is overwrought. I don't think you can tell that much about either of them other than the fact that they were both engaged in this debate. I don't think that either one of them behaved any differently than they usually do in their interactions in day-to-day politicking. That was substantially different for Biden, and it wasn't his overall body language that convinced people that there was something wrong. It was quite literally his utter inability to complete any kind of sentence in the first debate that was sentient. I was in a room with almost 600 Republicans, Democrats, and independents, and the room took a collective gasp. He was significantly different than the way that people expected him to be based on other appearances where they had seen him. I do not think that as long as both candidates are engaged, there's any substantial movement from voters because of small differences in their body language at the debate. I think you need something big to actually move voters on this. And Trump and Harris both stepped over the bar in that regard, and nothing else changes.
Yeah, I don't want to risk us re-adjudicating the previous debate. So let me, John, it looked like you had something to say there.
I was just going to say, just a quick note on the role of the moderators. I'm going to respectfully disagree with my colleague Mike here. I think once you open the door to a more activist role in terms of real fact checking and all of that, it turns into editorializing. And I just don't think that's the role of the moderators. The role of the moderators is to ask the questions, to keep track of time, try to get everyone to comply with the rules. But at the end of the day, I mean, to use the example of, who won the last election and all that, I mean, Harris is more than capable of pointing out the facts on that. And, and I think the average American person, frankly, can see one candidate got 81 million votes, the other got 74 million votes. They don't need to be told that by the moderators. I mean, maybe I'm just more of a, I'm personally, I'm an ex-journalist turned attorney because I just didn't like the way the state of journalism was going. I thought it was pretty bad 10, 12 years ago. I think it's gotten a lot worse since then. But I do think it's just, it's becoming more of an activist role than it is being an objective sort of, like news anchor role to just ask the questions, let the candidates talk, and let the voters decide.
I do remember one line from the Biden-Trump debate, and that was, "There's only one convicted felon on this stage." I thought that hit home, and there were quite some others. And I think that sometimes, I'm not trying to say there wasn't a bad debate. It was a bad debate, but I think there's also some exaggeration in terms of the level of how bad things are in the political realm. To Elizabeth's point, sometimes we blow up perception as it pertains to body language, and not just body language, but other performative aspects of a presidential campaign. But I think Kamala Harris's strategy tonight was to let Trump be Trump, to let him speak. And I think she was effective in letting him speak. And I think that's why she, after a while, it started to show on her face. She was actually having a little bit of fun over the course of this debate, watching Trump, just go crazy on that debate stage tonight.
I want to.
I agree with that. I think there were definitely some places where you just saw her. Like one point, I even wrote into my notes, see if I can find it, that she chuckled and then she grinned. And I think it was one of the places where she was describing Trump as extreme. She was very excited. Hang on. There we go. When they were the follow-up question to Trump on immigration, asking him why he killed the bipartisan bill. And he went off on conspiracy theories about Ohio again. And Harris positively grinned and laughed and said, talk about extreme. And then brought up Republicans for Harris who are concerned about the attitudinal extremism of Trump. And I thought that was an extremely strong moment for her. And I also thought it was very clearly one that she had hoped for, if not planned for. And she was thrilled that she got to use her, she got to give her speech about Republicans for Trump in that moment.
So I'm sorry, Elizabeth. I wanted to... I've mentioned this before in the Republican presidential debates that Trump did not participate in this year, and it still has stuck with me up through the Biden debate, up through the Harris debate. I made the mistake back in those debates of reading Harry Joffe's Crisis of the House Divided. It just so happened around that same period of time. For those of you who don't know, that is the book that details 400 plus pages of the argument between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas and the great Lincoln-Douglas debates. I mean, we're pulling on Aristotle, we're pulling on, the Greeks and the Romans and the greatest philosophers of all time all get congealed into what is probably the greatest American debate ever had. And it crushed my soul watching what we call debates today. And so I say that with, I want to be a little charitable because I think there is value in these things that we call debate, but really to me, it's more political theater. It's more political brinksmanship. There's an art to it. There's a science to it almost. And in fact, I saw this so many times during the debate tonight, and I don't know if this was on all stations, but at least the channel I was watching, the candidate would start talking, and then there would be this little marquee underneath them stating what the question was. And I guarantee if you're playing Jeopardy, there's no way you could have derived the question from most of these responses. I mean, most of these responses is to immediately pivot to here's what the other side got wrong. And so it's not a debate, I guess, in that traditional Lincoln Douglas sense, right? Of here are some propositions, here are my principles, and let me try to understand my opponent's principles as he would argue them, and then explain why he's wrong. Right? In fact, you spent most of this debate, both candidates claiming the other person believes something that they said, I don't believe that. And so I guess there's I don't know, maybe I'm just looking for some sort of solidarity here. Is this a concern? Is this something that other people share? Or is this just the world we live in? Because, part of me thinks if Abraham Lincoln were to run for president today, he would take a shellac and never could make it past the first rounds because that style isn't something that resonates with us like it once did. It leaves a person too vulnerable. But I also wonder if at times there is a hunger for sort of a bit more, I guess what I would call honesty, I suppose, and not in truth telling, but just honesty and correctly stating, here is my position. I fully understand my opponent's position, and here's why my position is still the better one for you.
So as a former political consultant, I'm going to take off my Braver Angels hat for a second and put my political consultant hat on. This is partially our fault. Partially the fault of political consultants, that is, and campaign managers, because something that you teach your candidates in debate training is not to answer the question that they're asked, but instead to answer the question for which they prepared. Mm-hmm. Answer the question that they want to answer. Answer the question that you think should have been asked, and find a way to bridge whatever they asked, bridge to the answer that you've prepared. So that you are never responding to something in an unprepared, unvarnished way. because the risk of an unvarnished, unprepared answer to go bad is higher than the risk of someone saying, oh, well, they didn't actually really answer that question and being seriously upset over it. Putting my Braver Angels cap back on and pulling off my political consultant hat. This is something that I'm trying to solve for with my Braver Politics candidate debates in Braver Angels. I designed them in a way that is supposed to increase issue conflict and decrease personality conflict between the candidates. So the places where I would have had a moderator step in this debate, for example, was when Donald Trump called Kamala Harris a Marxist. And when Kamala Harris called Donald Trump extreme. Both of those things are characterizations of each other's behavior or each other's attitudes. And instead, I would have said, what is it that you believe is extreme about the things that he has just said? And when I would have said, please explain, why do you believe she's Marxist? What is it that you are trying to point to? What are your underlying concerns? Neither one of them, they were using those words as a shorthand to demonize their opposition. And that's what I try to reduce in my Braver Politics debate, while forcing them to actually get into arguments about the things that they disagree about and acknowledge the things that they agree on. Sorry, a little personal plug here.
That's right.
The cynical side of me thinks that the role of the ideal political candidate, or not even the role, but the approach of the ideal successful political candidate, is essentially to be Lucille Bluth from Arrested Development. I don't understand the question, and I won't respond to it. And the better that you can.
By the Cal, you've seen those memes, haven't you, of who said it, Donald Trump or Lucille Bluth?
I mean, back in 2014, before he was the nominee, I said that Donald Trump sounds like when Lucille Bluth talks to her Mexican housekeeper in Arrested Development.
They don't sneak into the country to be your friend, Cal.
What's that?
So they don't sneak into the country to be your friend.
See, yeah, 100%. Who said it? Donald Trump, Lucille Bluth. The more I think that there are far too many candidates who have that attitude, and they don't necessarily pull it off very well. I don't think either candidate pull it off very well here. What I mean by that is sort of Elizabeth's ideal that she talked about, is that that consultants want the candidate to frame it as, here's what I wish the question had been, I'm going to respond to that. They didn't even sound like they were in the same universe, the responses and the questions, much like you said. The idealist part of me, the Aaron Sorkin politics part of me, wishes that these look like the West Wing debates from seasons 25 years ago. Those don't look anything like the real world anymore. I would like there to be debates that are more substantive, more persuasive, more honest. But is that something that I can realistically ask for? I don't know. I appreciate that Elizabeth is trying to bridge that gap between the realism and another way to talk about this.
Apparently, it's Elizabeth's. Yeah, it's Elizabeth's fault. Apparently, that's what I'm getting.
At least she knows that it, and acknowledges that it is, and she's trying to fix it now. So.
I just want to jump in. I want to jump in. I would argue that even in the Lincoln Douglas debates in 1858, there was rhetoric used. Stephen Douglas called Lincoln a radical on the issue of slavery. He exaggerated Lincoln's stance to alienate moderate voters. Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, said that Douglas was willing to compromise on the issue of human freedom for political gain, which he contrasted with his own position. In the Kennedy-Nixon debate, which was nearly 100 years later, Richard Nixon characterized Kennedy as inexperienced, someone who would not be safe in a Cold War society. Kennedy's closing remarks framed the election as a choice between the past and the future. he said it's time for a new generation of leadership. Nixon, by contrast, attempted to frame Kennedy as inexperienced, untested. So we've seen this before in history. I think where the difference lies is in this era of Donald Trump, since he came down the escalator in 2015, politics has become less about characterizing your position and now characterizing your character, making you the enemy. And that's where I believe the line is drawn, where we're no longer challenging each other on, you're just misguided on the issue. But we both understand and we have an appreciation and a love for this country. Now it's you're a patriot or you're not. And that is new and specifically unique to this candidacy and Donald Trump. The fact that you have Dick Cheney, waterboarding Guantanamo Bay Dick Cheney, embracing the Democratic nominee for president, and his daughter embracing the Democratic nominee for president, Jeff Duncan, national security advisors for Mike Pence. That speaks volumes to the fact that those who are conservatives see the Democratic Party now as the vessel to jump on for the continuation of democracy. And that should raise alarm bells for many reasons. And I think that as we're going to continue the conversation about the future of presidential debates, part of what we need to be clear on is to ensure that, we're not normalizing and accepting and even, just giving legitimacy to this idea that, you could call someone crooked or call someone an enemy of, someone who's not a patriot, someone who's not an American. These are things that would never before enter into politics before 2015. And now it's become so normalized. And I think that, as we're juggling.
I'm sorry. I
not
have
finished.
to push back on this.
I'm not finished. As we're juggling this issue between, how moderators should go about navigating through debates, I think we also should be cautious to not be so beholden to the old rules that we don't realize the threat in front of us. Meaning, we don't want to be so we don't want to act as if things are so normal, like we're still dealing with Bush versus Kerry, so much so that when someone outrightly says something that is completely undemocratic and potentially and actually reminiscent of dictators abroad, that we don't ring alarm bells. I think that we don't want the American people. We don't want to become numb to this kind of thing.
So, Elizabeth, I'll give you a chance to respond briefly, but I want John to have it. If you don't mind, could you respond briefly, and then John, feel free to get in because it's been a bit since we've heard from you.
I just want to push back on this characterization of this is a new thing since 2015. As far back as the 2004 presidential election, you had the argument that Bush lied, people died from the left. The accusation against John Kerry was that he didn't really earn his Purple Heart. I'm fairly young, which means that my political history of partisan debates around campaigns is fairly young. So I don't know enough to go too much further back until you go back into ancient history, early American history. But you've had characterizations of candidates as less than patriotic and as un-American for a very long time. That there have been occasions where good candidates have pushed back on those accusations does not change that. Like, this isn't new with Donald Trump. People have impugned character for forever. A major issue as far back as you had Bill Clinton in 1993, who the character issue was that he was caught. I'm sorry, not 93, later than that, was caught cheating with Monica Lewinsky in the White House. And it was all about the character of the president. You have long-term history of presidential campaigns being about defining different candidates' characters. So I just wanted to push back on that claim that that's new since 2015.
And I just wanted to be clear, it's not just character, but also the very fabric. The very fact that when you lose, you concede, right? That's something that has never been challenged before. Every election night, the pundits get together, and after the votes are counted, they praise the fact that there's going to be a peaceful transition of power, that after the losing candidate concedes, that's it. There's now going to be a meeting between the incoming president and the outgoing president. People are coming together to celebrate the incoming president, and then we move forward. That is now being challenged. You have the running vice president for the Republican Party saying that if he were in the position of Mike Pence, he would do what Mike Pence couldn't do. He would violate the Constitution. He would send an alternate slate of electors. That is what I'm getting at. And I think, to the point of character, I mean, I guess I should have been more sharp in what I was trying to say. I mean, the fact that you have a Republican nominee for president who, to this day, refuses to apologize for saying that that John McCain was a loser because he was captured. I mean, these are things that Lincoln and Douglas, I believe, couldn't fathom, that Kennedy and Nixon couldn't fathom. And I think that sometimes we put too much emphasis and stock in verbiage like extreme, and then we don't look at actually what's extreme. What's extreme is that for the first time in history, we have a candidate who refused to this day to accept the results of the previous election. And even on that debate stage, refused to even acknowledge the fact that even when he slipped up and said he lost by a whisker, that it was an admission that he had lost. That's extreme. And we have to be honest about that if we want to continue this system, if we want to continue to have the same rules that have guided this country for nearly 250 years.
I think.
Well, let's let John slip.
Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Has anyone else noticed this poll from the New York Times Siena College that finds almost half the electorate thinks Kamala Harris is too liberal, but only a third find Trump to be too conservative? I mean, if we're talking about extremism and ideology, I find that interesting. And Mike invoked Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney earlier. If anyone's been paying attention, there are a lot of never Trump or conservative types like the Cheneys, like David French and others, who have been griping about this all year, about Trump's stance on abortion, Trump's stance on foreign policy, Trump's stance on tariffs and entitlement reform. And, so they've been making the case that they actually don't think he's conservative enough, that he is too moderate. Although I don't get the part where then they decide they're going to vote for Kamala Harris, because that just doesn't make any sense to me ideologically. And I'm old enough to remember when, the far right was screaming for years how the Bushes and the McCains and the Romneys weren't conservative enough, weren't being ideologically pure enough. And yet when we get a poll that shows half the American public thinks Kamala Harris is too liberal, but only a third thinks Trump is too conservative, it's been silence from the far right and from the conservative types, which again shows me that there are alternative motives in play. I think for the never Trumper types, it's personal grudges more than anything else, because I can't make sense of that ideologically. How you think Trump is not conservative enough, so you're going to support Kamala Harris? And then on the flip side, let me just finish on the flip side with the far right. Again, as when the American public perceives Trump as being more moderate than conservative, and they're not saying anything about it, to me, that tells me their ulterior motives is more about being culture wars and anti-establishment and owning the libs, rather than any sense of ideological purity. That's my
there is a long-standing tradition here at Saving Elephants that a lot of what's wrong with the world can be traced back to the French Revolution, and in some ways their measurement of left versus right, and I don't think we should throw it out the window. Some people do, but I think that does get us off sometimes. What is extreme? What do we mean by extreme? By some measurements, Donald Trump is the most extreme candidate. By others, he's a flaming moderate. I mean, George W. Bush was more extreme on certain issues, if we're just looking at a strict left-right scale. I think you can also measure that in a populist versus the elite, or maybe a populist versus urban, rural or urban. There are other ways to measure this, and there are some ways in which, as you mentioned, the far right did say Romney, McCain, Bush, they're not extreme enough, right? Then we get a guy whose policies are less extreme, but he's more populist, and he speaks their language. He antagonizes those very people. And so I get kind of, I think this thing gets muddled in a hurry, because I think we need language to be able to act. So many people talk about Donald Trump, and I've even said this myself. He is a threat to the United States of democracy. And John, you may just completely disagree with that. But part of the problem is when I say it, I mean something very different dare I say, extremely different than what I think a lot of my counterparts on the left mean when they say that. And we lack that kind of vernacular. I think Trump does pose a danger to the United States in a way that's unique that Kamala Harris doesn't. Ironically, I tend to side more with Trump's policies. So I think, John, you and I are looking at the same thing. And I'm not a Harris supporter, but we almost have two different. We have a lot of the same, I guess, inputs, and then we kind of have this slightly different output there. And Elizabeth, you've been digitally raising your hand to get in here. What is it you wanted to say?
So this is.
Can we
I
get
have a
more kidding,
whole-
by the way?
What's that?
Can we get more kidding, by the way? I saw
Yeah.
he made a cameo there.
He did. He ran away now. My husband's in the kitchen, so I'm sure he's in there stalking his feet. That is Teddy. Yes, he's named after Teddy Roosevelt.
Nice. I love it.
This is a little bit of a rabbit hole, but bear with me. Because
well, and let me, I tell you what, before we start, Elizabeth, we're coming close to the end of the hour, so by all means, I'll let you get a chance to speak, but just bear in mind, this will probably be you wrapping up, and if you had any brief closing thoughts, I wanted to give you an opportunity as you're speaking.
Okay, I will try to make this as concise as possible also. The shortest version is that I think we're in the midst of a really significant political realignment, and that alignment is no longer along the lines of ideology, rather it is along the lines of attitude. So there's ideological extremism and attitudinal extremism. And you have, let's call it a 60-40 scale in the country, or 60-40 spectrum. Frank Luntz, the noted pollster, says that 60% of Americans say they would prefer to have an elected official who compromises to get things done, even if they don't get everything that they promised or wanted. 40% of the country would prefer to have an elected official who never compromises and stands on principle, even if they don't get everything that they wanted or promised. So I think of this as the attitudinal versus ideological spectrum. The ideological people are in the 60%. They have their political differences. They have their different political intuitions, but they generally agree on the container for politics. They agree on the way government should work generally. They might have their differences. They might want to fuss with the Supreme Court. They might disagree about the filibuster, but they generally agree that we live in a democratic republic. They agree that competition between parties is good. They agree that there are generally there is generally a significant difference between people in parties that matters. And they value having an adversarial relationship between them and checks and balances in government. Then there's the bottom 40% that says you should never compromise. They hate everybody in the 60%. And right now, they hate the ones that are conservative a little bit more than they hate the ones that are progressive. And I use progressive advisedly here, not liberal, because they believe that the people in the 60% have actually been oppressing them and keeping them out of democracy. And so they think the only way for them to be heard is to make this uncompromising stand. However, they're not ideological in any way, shape, or form. They don't have beliefs. They have reactionary frustrations to their lack of trust, to their lack of understanding of how things work, and to their anger at feeling as though they've been identified as the oppressors, but they feel like they're the oppressed. And they are zero-sum thinkers. They think there's a limited pie and they have too small of a piece of it right now, and they want to get their bigger piece back. And then you've got us up at the top in the 60% saying like, hey guys, we just need to fight really hard against that other group that disagrees with us. And it's a mess. It doesn't make any sense with our old conservative liberal idea with our left-right split. It's not like that anymore. And so I think it's easy when you think about it in that way to understand why there are some really strong ideological conservatives who are so afraid of the chaos of Trump's attitude and the attitudinal extremism and non-ideological nature of him and his supportive base, that they would prefer to support someone who they see as attitudinally normal and supporting the normal general contours of our current form of government, even if they disagree with them on a lot, even if they have quibbles with how they would specifically put together government. At least they're not trying to burn it down. At least they trust them to not exceed the bounds of our normal attitudinal expectations for the presidency. They expect them to be essentially sane people who they strongly disagree with, and they would prefer that to someone who they currently agree with on more things in terms of policy, but they do not trust for a second that that policy is static.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And as I mentioned, we'll go around the horn. John, Cal, Mike, feel free to give your closing argument.
Well, I'll go ahead and just mention, as the conversation continued, I'm just reminded of the fact that Trump is not an ideologue. Trump has donated to both the Hillary Clinton campaign for Senate and the Kamala Harris campaign for DA. And so I say that in light of the fact that, as we're talking about what constitutes extremism, I think it could be said that he is an extreme on both a fundamental constitutional level and on a policy level. When you look at the fact that 60% of the American people are closer, and objectively, the facts, the polls, these are what, NORC polls, New York Siena College polls, PBS polls say 60% of the American people are closer to the left, to the left and the right on almost every issue that we go down on, whether it's abortion, whether it's gun control, whether it's LGBTQ rights, climate change. You look at the fact that, Donald Trump has repeatedly embraced, and his party has, toyed with and wrestled with the national abortion ban. And you look at the fact that the definition of extremism is furthest from the center or a given point, either of two abstract things that are as different from each other as possible. I think it fits the definition adequately. When you look at the fact that, you have a candidate who, to this day, will refuse to accept the results of the previous election, and you have him going around and continuing to tell people that he rightfully was the winner of that last election. That's extreme as it pertains to the very system in which our country is based on, checks and balances, the way in which it's run. I would also argue that the Supreme Court is extreme by giving almost absolute immunity to the commander-in-chief. That was completely the furthest thing, I believe, from the framers' intent when they convened in the 18th century to compose the system of checks and balances that we enjoy today. And so, as the course of the conversation has gone on, I'm just reminded of the stakes at play and how important it is to draw contrasts, especially in an election like this. I've always said, and Josh, you've heard me say it on my show, this is the most important election, I believe, most consequential election since 1864. And I don't say that just, I literally say that our system of government can continue as it is with checks and balances, or it could be completely different. And if you don't believe it, just look at Trump's words himself. He has actually quoted a dictator in the course of tonight's debate as proof as to why he should be commander-in-chief again. He refused in Helsinki to accept the words of his own national security and intelligence community over the word of Vladimir Putin. If that's not extreme, I don't know what is.
Thanks, Mike. Cal, John?
Cal, you go ahead.
Yeah, so closing statement. I'll try to make it a little bit more on point than Trump's closing statement earlier today.
That's a low bar.
I'm going to be all over the place a little bit. First of all, Josh, are you sure that all bad things are a result of Woodrow Wilson and not the French Revolution?
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Secondly, I want to emphasize, since we're not taking time out for this topic to be the center of the debate, I want to emphasize something that Elizabeth said: the distinction between people who believe in a zero-sum game versus not. When that comes to politics, when it comes to economics, when it comes to foreign policy, all sorts of things, that is a huge divide that is becoming a point. I think that is the divide of the realignment. I think that that's huge. I think that I find myself in many ways aligned with people who don't have a zero-sum mentality more than I do with a specific ideological position in a lot of cases in politics today. And I think that itself could be its own very fascinating debate and discussion. So I want to emphasize that, even though we can't really get into and talk about that too much. But the thing that strikes me so much over and over again throughout this whole process is that we spend so much time talking about how different things are since 2015, since Trump showed up. And so many approaches to politics, after emphasizing that, they just repeat the exact same thing from decades before. It's the same politics, it's the same policy ideas, it's the same ideology, it's the same description of opponents. The funny thing is, the irony is that it might actually be true now. But if we talk some of the examples brought up earlier, I think of with President Bush in the debates in 2004, or characterizations of McCain. But I mean, Romney is a good example of this. 2012, talking about him apparently letting people die or something, and according to some ad that was run, Mitt Romney's basically a negligent homicide, or maybe even a murderer. Like, this sort of dialogue, we're not going to bring people to the other side of the aisle by gaslighting the other side about what has been said before and what will continue to be said about the other side, even when the craziness ends and when these people who ride down escalators have left our politics. Instead, if we're going to change things, then we need to come up with a different approach. We need to not pretend that things are different and act the same. I don't know exactly on a grand scale what that looks like from the conservative perspective. It's something that I've wrestled with because I still am the same conservative that I was before I wouldn't vote for Donald Trump, and haven't voted for a lot of Republicans since he's run for office. And yet I don't know exactly what the effective way of changing how I talk about politics is. I just know that we need one, and I can very easily recognize when it's the same old from others as well. So I see the problem. I don't know that I have a solution, but I know we need one.
I'll go next. In terms of when things changed, I've always been of the opinion that I think the 2012 election broke a lot of minds on the right, particularly when Romney won the suburbs and lost the election. He won independents and lost the election. Look at the exit poll data. It was after that a lot of people on the right just said, all right, to hell with it. If you can make a milquetoast Mormon Boy Scout look like, Gordon Gekko from Wall Street or Mr. Burns, then we're just going to, go all in on someone who doesn't give a blink and will stick the middle finger right back. And so when Trump won the election in 2016, I think it broke a lot of minds on all sides. And then in 2020, when Trump lost, it broke a lot of minds on the right again. So I think this is something that's been going on for the better part of 12 years now. In terms of where we go from here, I think every election is going to be close because we're just living in polarized times. I keep telling people, people keep asking me, like, who do you think is going to win? Who do you think is going to win? And I'm like, look, all I can tell you is at this point, Clinton was up by 6 points and lost by less than 100,000 votes in 3 states. And at this point in 2020, Biden was up by 7 points and lost by less than 50,000 votes in 3 states. And right now, Harris is up by 2. So you know, either way, I think it's literally going to come down to tens of thousands of votes in 3 states again. Probably, we're just living in a very polarized time, and I think it's going to be a long way before we see anything like landslide elections that we saw throughout the 20th century, or you know, the map changing much. I mean, you know, these days it's only 5 or 6 states that are even in contention. The rest of the map is just so fixed. No matter what, no matter who's running, no matter what's happening in the country, you know, 40 to 45 states will either always vote red or always vote blue, and nothing's going to change that.
Well, I appreciate the appropriate ending on a pessimistic note, as we often do on saving elephants. You're in good company here. I am very disappointed that Beyonce did not show up. I'm sorry about that, guys. I was looking forward to that, but I am ever so grateful for John Cowell. Yeah,
I did not expect her to have more technical difficulties than I had.
Yeah. You'd think her people could get on that. We'll have to.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to. I guess we'll just have to go with Taylor Swift next time. Cal, John, Elizabeth, and Mike, thank you all so much for participating in another roundtable. Thank you out there, everybody who was watching, and we will see you all next time.
Thanks,
Thank
Josh.
you for having me.
Mm-hmm.